What's up, guys? So I've been working really hard on a game recently. I've been working on it for like the past year about. It's called Blunderbuss. It's a little bit like Nuclear Throne if you played that game, but it's kind of set in this fun pirate world, and I'm really excited for people to play it, for it to be out there. But in classic me fashion, I have had another idea, and I've started working on that instead. Not to say that I won't finish the original idea. It's still gonna happen. It's still happening. It's still currently happening, but my attention is now divided, and I'm starting this new game, which is simpler, and I intend to keep it smaller than Blunderbuss, but I thought it would be fun to create a little devlog series of just kind of going through the process of making this game and documenting, you know, that whole thing. Just a heads up right off the bat, I have never taken a coding class. I am completely self-taught, and I am still self-teaching. So if you are like a computer whiz, if you're like a coding guy and you watch this, you're probably going to be frustrated. But if you're not, maybe it will inspire you to get into it. Because I am not a math guy, but as I've been learning, I've really fallen in love with it, and I'm having a lot of fun learning to build games. So yeah, why don't we just dive right in? So this game is called Daedalus. It is set in the world of Greek mythology, and it follows Daedalus, who was the father of Icarus. For those of you who haven't heard the myth, who've been living under a rock, Icarus and his father were imprisoned by King Minos. To escape their imprisonment, his father, Daedalus, who was an inventor, an artist, a craftsman, he created these wings of wax to fly them across the ocean to freedom. Of course, as they were escaping, Icarus flew too close to the sun. The sun melted the wax on his wings, and he fell into the ocean and drowned. His father, though, Daedalus, escaped. A lot of people don't really talk about that when they talk about the myth of Icarus. So the premise for this game that I had was you play as Daedalus, seeking vengeance for the death of your son, going after Helios, who's the god of the sun in Greek mythology. I thought it'd be fun to kind of create this Flappy Bird-esque game. Flappy Bird, but make it Greek mythology. So that's where the idea originated. And I thought that wouldn't be too hard to pull off. And I also had some cool ideas pertaining to like art and stuff like that. So that's where this all started. Of course, with game design, which I learned the hard way, you should never start with the art because a lot of things change during the process. Starting with the art and making polished sprites and assets and stuff is only going to cost you time down the line. It's better to figure out base mechanics and make sure you have a game that works to some extent before you spend too much time polishing art and stuff like that. So that being said, I started with just this white square with a wing on it, which pissed me off because it just looks so ugly. But I know what happens when I spend too much time on art too early. I change things and then I have to redo the art and I just waste time. So I started with the square, I drew a wing on it, I had one frame of the animation with the wing up and then one frame with the wing down, and that was the whole animation. The animations in this game I don't think are going to be too crazy. The idea is you press the space bar, it switches to this frame with the wing down. After a little bit, the wing goes back up, you start to fall again, and that's the basic idea. I also wanted to introduce combat to this game, so I didn't want it to just be Flappy Bird. I wanted to have some enemies that are coming in, I wanted to have some boss fights later on, stuff like that. So I gave Daedalus a bow and arrow, and the way that the bow and arrow works is you can't flap your wings while you're aiming it. The wings are fastened to like leather straps on his arms, so if he's doing anything else with his arms, he can't flap his wings. I thought that would be a fun gameplay thing, make it a little bit more challenging, where you have to time out these arrow shots so that you don't fall and die, basically. So I created some equally ugly sprites for the bow and arrow. I had one where it's aiming to the right, one where it's aiming to the left, aiming up and aiming down. The idea would be to flap your wings, you're pressing space. To go left and right, you're pressing the arrow keys. And to aim your bow, you're holding either W, A, S, or D, based on what direction you want to shoot an arrow. So with all of my ugly sprites ready to go, I went over and created my player object. By the way, for this game, I'm using Game Maker. That's what I've used for all my games. It's super beginner friendly. There's even like a block coding option in it, which is great, and it's really intuitive, so I really just couldn't recommend it enough for beginners. So I created my player object. I went into the create event, and first of all, I just set the gravity. So Game Maker has a built-in gravity function. I just set it to 0.2 as a temporary thing, but that actually ended up looking pretty good once I got into it, so I just left it at that. Next thing I did was start making some variables. So the first variable I made was flap cooldown. I was thinking I'm going to need to have some variable to control how rapidly the player is able to flap their wings. I wanted there to be some sort of buffer or cooldown in between flaps. So I created that, and I just set it to 0 at first. Then I also created a variable for the player's HP because I knew there was going to be some combat going on later on. And I created a separate variable for wing HP. Going back to the myth, the closer that you fly to the sun or the top of the screen where the sun will eventually be, the more your wings melt. As your wings melt, your height that you're able to flap gets lower and lower and lower until eventually you fall and die. So that's the main idea. So the more time the player spends at the top of the screen, the more their wings are going to become melted and the less height they'll be able to get with their flaps. I also set the player's movement speed, and I would go back to this create event a few times and adjust some things and change some variables, but I was just trying to get started and set something up that I could work with. So once that was all in there, I popped my player object into the room with a nice gray backdrop, and I ran the game, and he fell to his death, so everything is working as expected so far. The next thing I did was I created a key press event for the spacebar. It just seemed like the easiest way to control the flapping just in its own event. And basically what I did in there was, first I just changed the image index. It changes from the first frame of the wing up to the frame of the wing down. And then I set an alarm to go off after 15 frames that would set the image index back to 0. Then I created a step event, which for anyone who hasn't used Game Maker or made games, it's just an event that runs every single frame of your game. So what I did in there was I made an if statement that basically says if the image index is 1, so if the player's wings are down, we're just subtracting 1 from the flap cooldown variable, and then once it hits 0, the cooldown has run out, basically. And so then in that alarm 0 event where I'm switching the image index back to 0, I'm also just resetting that flap cooldown variable. So essentially, every time the wings go down, that cooldown timer starts to go down, and that just measures how long the player has to wait before they can flap again. So I tweaked some of these variables a little bit, I reworked some stuff. Basically what I ended up with was a white square that would move in a very Flappy Bird-esque fashion. When I press space, the wings would go down, it would go up, then it would start to fall again until I press space again, with a little bit of a cooldown to make sure I'm not just spamming spacebar. So the next thing I did was just go back to that step event and add some keyboard checks for right and left key so I could add some horizontal movement. So basically the player can move right and left and press spacebar to flap their wings. That left and right movement ended up looking a little bit rigid, so I worked on it a little bit and tried to create something where basically as you're holding down the left or right key, your movement speed in that direction is increasing until it hits like the maximum, and then as you let go, instead of just stopping abruptly, it kind of slowly decreases. And that ended up looking a little bit better, felt a little bit smoother, felt like you were flying rather than just kind of moving across the screen. So I tested that all out and it looked pretty good. And then I started trying to figure out how I would implement this wing strength sort of mechanic where if you fly to a certain height, your wings start melting and the strength of your flaps decreases. And so at this point I actually changed my wing HP variable. At first it was 100, which was the same as my player's health, but I actually changed it to 6 because my thought was that I could directly apply that variable onto the height that the player can flap, basically. So at first I had the vertical speed as -6, and so instead of having it -6, I just changed every time you press spacebar, the V speed, the vertical speed, is wing HP times -1. So however high your wing HP is how high you're going to be able to flap. So the way that works is if they're in the top portion of the screen, an alarm gets set, and that alarm gets reset as long as they're up there. And each time the alarm goes off, it subtracts a little bit from their wing HP, which in turn lowers the height of their flaps. And that worked out pretty nicely. It was a little unforgiving at first, I had to tweak some numbers, but in the end it ended up feeling pretty good. Once I had all that squared away, I started working on the attack code. So basically my thought was, if the player's holding down W, A, S, or D, I want the sprite to switch to the correct bow aiming sprite. And then I had to figure out also how to increase the damage based on how long they've been holding down the key. And so the way I ended up doing that was I had some variables for aiming up, aiming down, left, and right. Depending on which key they were pressing, the sprite index changed to the correct sprite. And then I had some alarms going for changing the actual image index of the sprite. So the first frame was the bow with the string just completely straight up and down. Next frame, it had been pulled back a little bit, and the third frame, it was all the way back. So my plan was to translate the image index to the damage. So if the arrow is released on the first frame, it deals 1 damage. If it's released on the second frame, it deals 2, and so on. And that ended up working nicely. Once I had all that working, I added a little bit of code to the arrow object, which basically just destroyed it if it left the room, because I didn't want a bunch of arrows just floating around clogging up my freaking computer. So at this point I'd been working for about an hour and 40 minutes, and I already had a really solid base. The arrows were working nicely, the flapping mechanics felt good, and I decided to move on to a little bit of art. Yeah, I did. I started doing a little bit of art. So with the art, I had been looking at a lot of paintings of Daedalus and a lot of other like Renaissance art and that sort of stuff. And I wanted to kind of capture that sort of vibe, but in a pixel art form. So like really well-toned muscles, that kind of thing, these like elaborate poses. So with Daedalus, I kind of had him one leg sort of up. You could see like the shading on his stomach as he was kind of twisting, and I made him ripped, obviously. He's just a ripped old man, because they loved ripped old men back then. I was looking at a lot of these pictures, dude, a lot of these paintings, and they're like Icarus is like standing totally nude, kind of like 1 foot up, like kind of like flaunting his stuff. I'm like, these guys were down bad, dude. Like they needed to get something out of their system. I don't know what it was. They needed to express something. Anyways, yeah, it took me a little bit. For a while it was looking a little weird, but I kind of got it to a place that I liked. I picked this kind of like golden yellow color for his wings just because I thought it looked very cool and sort of heroic, I guess. At first I had him basically bald, but I decided to give him long flowing locks of gray hair instead to just kind of accentuate that heroic aura that he had. I was feeling really good about the art at this point. I was getting it to a place where it was basically exactly what I had in my head, and I was just really, really satisfied with how it was turning out. But at this point, I actually decided to change the way I was doing things a little bit. Instead of just having the first frame be wings up, second frame wings down, I made it 2 separate sprites so that I could add a little bit extra movement and animation. And then I just had to tweak a little bit of the code to switch sprites rather than image index. Then I got to work on the attack sprites, and these were a bit of a pain. I went with a pretty detailed character design, which I think fits really well because it kind of looks like those old Renaissance paintings of these heroic figures, and I really liked that. But it did mean that I had my work cut out for me, especially with these kind of dynamic poses with the bow. The other thing was the wings were kind of getting in the way, so the way that I did it was the wings are strapped on to his arms, and so you can't really move the arms without moving the wings, and I needed to make it so that you could see what was going on with the bow clearly enough, even with a wing kind of covering a portion of it. So it took some finagling, but I eventually got it to a place where I was really happy with. Once that was all done, I set all of my key sprites to variables in the player object, so it was a little bit easier to refer to different things, and I didn't have to change too many things if I changed sprite names or anything later on. And then I changed my gray background to a nice sky blue, and it was finally starting to kind of look like a video game. And that was where I called it on day one. All in all, it was around 4 hours of work. And I got it to a place I was really satisfied with. It was looking nicer, you know, with some better art in there. And I had more hope that this would actually turn into something playable and enjoyable. Sometimes in that pre-art phase, I get kind of discouraged because it just kind of looks ugly and it's not really like the image that I had in my mind. But you really just need to stick it through. Once that art gets in there, the improvement is actually like crazy. Like it becomes a whole different thing. So yeah, that was day one. I'm excited to keep working on this project. Let me know if you guys want to see more of this kind of behind the scenes stuff. I'm thinking of doing a series of just these little devlog videos. Might not cover the entire process, but just sort of checking in here and there. So let me know if that sounds interesting. If you guys have any thoughts on things that could improve the game or things that you might like to see, things that, or if any ideas are being sparked in your minds, feel free to leave a comment, let me know. But other than that, I'm going to leave it here for today. Thanks so much for watching. Love you. Bye. I'm supposed to be looking here. That's the camera, not... I'm just looking at my freaking face. God.